Today is a special one for me. My third birth story. I hit 39 weeks. It was this feeling of this baby better come now because I don't know what I'm going to do otherwise. There was a big snowstorm. I do not want to have a baby in the middle of a snowstorm. There's this one contraction, this one moment where it just makes me say, we should go. Baby was a boy, and that room erupted in the girliest cheers.
Motherhood is all-consuming.
Having babies, nursing, feeling the fear of loving someone that much.
And there's this baby on your chest, and boom, your entire life has changed.
It's a privilege of being your child's safest space and watching your heart walk around outside of your body.
The truth is, I can be having the best time being a mum 1 minute, and then the next I'm questioning all my life choices.
I'm Lo Mansfield, your host of the Lo and Behold podcast. Mama of 4 littles, former labor and postpartum RN, CLC, and your new best friend in the messy middle space of all the choices you are making in pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. If there is one thing I know after years of delivering babies at the bedside and then having and now raising those 4 of my own, it is that there is no such thing as a best way to do any of this. And we're leaning into that truth here. With a mix of real life and what the textbook says, expert insights, and practical applications, each week we're making our way towards stories that we participate in, stories that we are honest about, and stories that are ours. This is the Lo and Behold podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the Lo and Behold podcast. Today is a special one for me. My their birthday is coming up. And so I thought it would be just a perfect time to share their third birth story. So you may have already listened to my other ones. I have 4 kids. My first birth story is actually episode 1. My second birth story is episode 13. And then now we're going to go ahead and do this one. And I share those right off the bat because you're going to hear me use some vocabulary like redemption or talk about kind of my state of mind when I was pregnant or wanting to get pregnant or why we, waited for a certain amount of time until we tried again. And so I think those stories are really valuable because they kind of set you up for where we are at this point, which was, I don't want to say not the healthiest point, but I had gone through a lot. I mean, long story short, again, just listen to those episodes and they'll kind of give you a clue of births and postpartums and what was going on. But I had lost my mom. My mom had died immediately after my first was born, and my second came relatively quickly after. And it was just a lot of brokenness and a lot of mess while I tried to raise these babies and put myself back together a little bit again. And so that's kind of short story about where we're kind of starting, or where my brain and my body and my mind were at as I started to think about having a third baby. How am I doing myself personally as a woman and as a mom and as a human being? And so I think it's really valuable to hear those first. So I encourage you to listen to those too. If you're wondering why some of this feels like, why were you so heavy? Why was everything such a mess? The other interesting thing about this is that my third was a, air quotes, COVID baby. We got to a place where we felt like we were ready to think about a third baby. And I'm going to get Kel on here soon for another episode where we talk about just the decisions to have more kids or not and all of that, because this comes up a lot, like on Instagram and in my social media communities. How do you know? How do you have more? What do you do when you don't agree? And I bring that up to say that Kel and I were both in agreement that we wanted a third. So that was not a complication for us. It was more just, when is the right time to try and see if we could make this happen. Naturally, when we started to feel ready, like a lot of you probably, COVID hit the world. And we really were at the point where we're like, let's try right when it happened. And the lockdown happened, as you guys remember, and basically no one was supposed to go anywhere. And we had no idea what this COVID was and what it would do or what it could do, and certainly what it could do for pregnancies. I'm sure some of you remember, especially if you were wanting to have a baby as well, that in the beginning of those months, especially, there was just this almost, I felt like this, like, don't get pregnant. If you are pregnant, oh shoot, we have no idea what this is going to do. And obviously we all know how things played out and how it changed pregnancies and really just how it changed birth experiences, which you can hear a little bit about in this story. So that was a lot to say. You guys know what COVID was like, but we did hit the point kind of right in that. And so we decided to just sit on it and wait for a little bit and kind of see, what this COVID thing was going to do and what it meant for pregnancies before we actually tried. And so by the time we felt comfortable trying, we kind of hit a place where it's like, okay, it seems things as if pregnancies more or less are progressing as normally, although the healthcare arena looked crazy, right? And we felt that as we moved through pregnancy, weird appointments, people not being allowed, being tested, all of that stuff. Like we walked through all of that. So we got to the point though where we're like, yeah, let's try. We feel comfortable trying and seeing what will happen. And so as a blessing, we got pregnant really quickly and really easily. So it was very much like okay, we are in it. We are having a COVID baby. I know I keep saying that, but I feel like for a while they just had this little, not stigma, but there was just this idea of like, if you had a COVID baby, that was a really specific experience to you. And certainly, I just want to honor that those of you who had babies in the middle of the shutdown, like in those first months, wow. What a struggle and what a hard thing for you right in the middle of the very beginnings of all of that. We more were, it had been about 9-10 months when we had our third. And so things were a little different and I would say a little better, though they were still very impacted by COVID and everything that was going on in the world. But I just like acknowledging that because, man, those of you who had your babies that February, that March, that April, that May, those first months, it was a lot. So well done for figuring out how to get through that. So like I said, we got pregnant pretty easily. We had as well with our first two babies. So maybe that was a hope or an expectation. I think my first two pregnancies were pretty textbook. And so my expectation was hopeful for that. Again, honestly, the baby's always measured normally. I ended up being GBS negative, both of my first two babies. No GDM, the gestational diabetes with my babies, no blood pressure issues, all of those things that we kind of keep an eye on during all the pregnancies. I just had an experience with my first two girls. And so I was hopeful and expecting the same as well. The challenges of my first two pregnancies were really all the personal and emotional stuff, right? My mom was essentially dying throughout my entire first pregnancy. And then she had just died throughout my second. So it was like, that was all about me and my grief, right? And the first one was like anticipatory grief and also walking through my mom being here, but still walking through all of that. And so I think I was really hopeful for a redemptive experience or just one where I wasn't so burdened by all of the other things that I had been so burdened by. Now, I'm a couple years out from losing my mom, so please don't assume that I was totally okay. I don't know that I would tell you I'm still okay now, years later, but I had felt like I'd had some time to not be such a broken version of myself, which was really what you will hear in that second birth story in episode 2 of, man, I was just a mess and then trying to have another baby and raise my two babies. My births with the girls as well were very textbook too. They were quick. The first time wasn't super, super quick. It wasn't, only an hour or whatever, but for our first timer, it was quick. It moved along very much, I'm air quoting again, like as they should, right? Like dilation continued, contractions got closer. We had this baby. It was amazing. It was such an incredible first experience. And then the second one was very quick. Classic, like second baby labor where contractions, I think we better go. Like I'm not hesitating at all. And so it really went kind of that like textbook cliche way as well with the second one. So I think as I moved through my pregnancy, I did have these expectations of this will likely go the way those first two girls had gone, like textbook, right? And I think that's an interesting thing to think about as an educator, right? Or a birth professional. There's just this idea of like, my instruction for you would always be to plan for this again as almost the first time, right? Especially as we're talking about birth. Like you can make some assumptions and some logical assumptions about your body and what happened last time, but every birth is different. And that is true for every postpartum. And then that's true definitely for breastfeeding, like every mom-baby couplet and dyad for breastfeeding is different. And so it's always this funky balance, especially in like my third and fourth births, of knowing what my history is and being hopeful for that, right? Because they've been so great, but also saying, hey, this is brand new every time. We still need to learn with Kelvin. We still need to go over all the things for all the different possibilities, the different ways birth might happen, the different things that could happen. We still really worked hard to set ourselves up for all the ways birth can happen. So again, hopeful for how it was and how I knew it could be based on the girls' births, but also open to the fact that this could be really different. Pregnancy-wise, this was my most different pregnancy up to this point. And looking back on it, sometimes people are, oh, the wives' tales, were they about having a boy or a girl or et cetera? I never felt like any of that held true in any of my pregnancies, but I was so tired in this pregnancy. But I had a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. I was so sick for me, not as sick as some of you are. So that's the way I judge it, is I was sicker than my other two, but not sick like hyperemesis gravidum, puking every day. Not that. I know that spectrum exists too, but so much sicker than I had been with my first two pregnancies, exhausted, like I said. It just felt really different. And none of this stuff was different in a clinical way worthy of note, really, if that makes sense. It just was, I thought, good Lord, this feels really different. And I feel pretty crappy and I'm exhausted and I have these little girls. And yeah. So as we move through pregnancy, I would say most of the clinical things remained really textbook. One thing that was different with this baby that I hadn't experienced with the other two was that I ended up having a marginal cord insertion. And essentially the idea of that is that the cord is supposed to insert in the middle of the placenta or around the middle of the placenta. And this one had inserted close to the edge of the placenta. And there's other cord insertions that can be even kind of more significant or mean a few more things, but a marginal cord insertion typically has great outcomes. Every once in a while, it can lead to a baby that has maybe some growth restriction or something like that. And so essentially when they see that cord on the edge of the placenta, the recommendation or the hope is that, hey, we're just going to, ultrasound the baby a couple extra times and just pay attention and make sure that they're growing as they should be. Because that marginal insertion, that kind of on the edge, the thought is that it could lead to kind of less blood flow to the baby, which could impact growth. That did not impact growth for babe at all. They stayed right on track. And so that really wasn't that big of a blip for us, just something that was new for me to experience personally. I meant another scan or two. I think I actually went ahead and denied one scan toward the end, kind of like a very end of pregnancy scan for growth, because babe had continued to track the whole time and was, per like fundal assessments at every prenatal appointment, continued to be right on point. And so I didn't want to pay for another scan, and baby seemed to be tracking along just fine after we had already an extra one or two scans. So that was a little extra new thing for us, but otherwise more or less everything, super, air quoting again, like normal, right? GBS negative, which I'm always hopeful for, since I like to have my babies unmedicated and try for that. It's just nice to not have to think about getting GBS antibiotics or getting there early. And so was grateful that I was GBS negative again. Physically, the last things I would just say is this pregnancy, I had SPD so bad, the symphysis pubis dysfunction. I was so sore. My lower back was a disaster. And this baby I carried so low. And I don't know that it was really it was probably a product of a lot of things. Third pregnancy in a few years, right? Is my third time being pregnant in 4 years. So that was probably one of them. Was I taking really good care of myself? And had I been? No, absolutely not. And that's really about everything that had gone on with 1 and 2 and losing my mom. I had been in survival mode, right? And so there were a lot of things that probably really compounded to make this pregnancy physically really, really, really hard. My worst one, spoiler alert, for when I share my fourth birth story and pregnancy, but that one was actually way easier than my third. So this one was rough. I remember wanting to be pregnant again when we decided to try and have a fourth and thinking, oh my gosh, but I hope it does not feel like that physically. I guess the lesson in that too is there were things I could have done better, like exercises, stretches, things that I could have done, even exercise leading up to that point. Like these things matter and they help. And I was doing them earlier on in other pregnancies. And by this point had done none of that and hadn't really taken care of myself well, like I already told you. And I think it just showed in physically how I was able to handle this pregnancy. So, you could wrap that up with an it is what it is. And that's kind of true. There are challenges in pregnancy, but I also always think like typically we have some answers and some help for some of the rough stuff. And I guess didn't have the bandwidth to even consider any of it and was just powering through, wearing my support belts and trying to move really carefully so as not to exacerbate my back and all of that and just deal a little bit. So not necessarily good advice, but that's what I did. I did go to the chiropractor as well. I will say that all the lower back pain, and then I like it for babies and fetal positioning too. So at the end, we are self-pay with all of that stuff. So practically speaking, financially, I don't go to the chiropractor my entire pregnancies because I can't afford it. I did do some at the end to try and just make sure I'm in alignment, make sure like everything down there is as good as it could be, particularly because things have been hurting so badly. I didn't mention this in this episode, but you would hear it in the other two birth stories. But my other kids had been born kind of right around the same time, just past 39 weeks, 39 and 2, 39 and 3. And so I hit 39 weeks in this pregnancy and I was so incredibly grumpy, so uncomfortable. Like I've told you, physically, feeling so challenged, and very much had the mindset, which you shouldn't have, because this isn't actually true, that my other kids came at 39 weeks or so. So this one will too. Like, why would I go past it? And that's not true. Some of us, it is true. And we have them all around the same time, but it's very normal to have your kiddos show up at 38 weeks and then 41 and then 39. Like that's just very possible. So I still had this silly notion that they would all show up near the same time. And so as I hit 39 weeks, it was this feeling of this baby better come now, because I don't know what I'm going to do otherwise. I don't know. If you've had a baby before, you probably know that feeling. So when we hit 39 weeks, there was a big snowstorm that was being predicted. So we were like 39-1 or so. So right at that point. And we lived in Colorado, and later, this was February time of year. And so later snowstorms, February, March, April, are really actually pretty common. We often get the most snow then. And so this one was going to be a doozy, right? Everyone was talking about it. And we had snowstorm coming and full moon. And that is like not a trifecta. We would need a third thing. Being 39 weeks, that was my trifecta, right? Being pregnant, snowstorm, full moon. And we both, Kel and I, were like, if we get past this snowstorm and this full moon, we're going to be shocked. And so we actually went to bed the night of the snowstorm and I think felt pretty nervous, because preference was at this point, no, thank you. I do not want to have a baby in the middle of a snowstorm. I do not want to drive. We have like a 30-minute drive to our hospital. We do not want to drive in the middle of this blizzard. You know, it kind of was one of those things where you so much want the baby to come, and then you hear this and you're like, oh, why don't you just wait like another day or two? I'm good with that. And so I think Kelvin was the most nervous. He's always scared about car babies, making it to the hospital. Now we had this history of faster labors. Like he just, I think, always thinks this is a setup for a situation that I don't want. So we did go to bed that night, and the snow was coming. And of course, around like 3 a.m., I woke up, and it was really similar to some of my other stories, but I woke up to go to the bathroom. And it felt very deja vu-y, like, I wonder if a contraction woke me up, because I've had that happen before, right? And so I didn't think anything else more of it. There was nothing going on, whatever. And so I just got back in bed. And then I noticed as I was sleeping in kind of like sleepy la-la land that I would have these twinges. And so I think that I was contracting. Like I couldn't, maybe like once an hour. I have no idea because I was never awake. I just kind of felt this awareness that had been happening while I had been sleeping those last few hours early in the morning. And so when we woke up around 7 and the girls woke up, I had told Kel, he's pumped that we didn't have a baby in the middle of the night, first of all. And then I had told him I did have, I think, some contractions. I don't know. It doesn't mean anything, right? And so he was working from home, which was nice. And I was just home with the girls. And so we just kind of went through our morning, and I kept having like these random occasional contractions, like nothing to call and tell a family member about. I wasn't updating Kelvin. I wasn't tracking. Like I'm just hanging out with the girls, particularly because of the knowledge that I have of just, the difference between prodromal labor and false labor. And like nothing was indicating that anything true or real was going on or worthy of note. And so it was this little thing in the back of my head, right? Which is good because it makes me think of that idea of teaching, how I teach, hey, ignore it, right? Like there's no point in really focusing on something that isn't true or real or capturing your attention and forcing you to pay attention. And that's very much what it was like this morning. It was like, that's interesting, and carry on. But as the morning continued, Kelvin would tell you, or I guess as we were getting more to like mid-afternoon, Kel would tell you that he knew that I was in labor. He says that he knows every time, even though I don't think I am. And so he would tell you that he was working like a crazy person in his office, like trying to get things done because he knew we were going to have this baby. And I was still just hanging out with the girls, watching TV, doing whatever. I would not say I was in labor at all. And certainly not any sort of labor that a care provider or anyone needed to know about. I don't even call that labor. Yeah, for me, it wasn't labor. But Kelvin believed it was, and it would be. And so this kind of continued. And you know what? We got to a point where things were like, every 12 minutes or something, something would happen. And then 8, and then 9, and then 12. And so again, nothing worth noting specifically, but also like, this is still happening. And so Kel, again, a little bit of a nervous Nelly sometimes about all of this. He really wanted to call our cousin and have her come over and just hang out with the girls just in case this turned quickly. which is good advice because if history were to repeat itself, and now with hindsight, like that is how it goes, and things turned very fast for me. And so we had our cousin come over around noon, and I still was just not sure. Like we still hadn't told anyone in the family about anything. I hadn't called my sister. We're still just hanging out. And when she showed up, I do remember I was in the kitchen chatting with her, and she was chatting with me, and I stopped and breathed, through a contraction, and then we're chatting, and I think maybe breathed through another one. So they were kind of close, a couple of minutes apart or a few minutes apart. But again, they'd been really random. This wasn't a normal pattern at all. And she looks at me and she goes, "Did you just have 2 contractions?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "What are you doing here?" Freaking out, right? Like, "You need to go to the hospital right now." And I'm like, "I'm fine. I literally am standing here talking to you in our kitchen. Like, this is not a person who needs to go to the hospital. That's for sure." So she was kind of not panicky, but it was just cute to see her response because it's not how I felt at all. So she was there. We put our 2-year-old to bed. It was her nap time. And then our cousin hung out upstairs with our 4-year-old for a little bit. And I thought, let's go downstairs to the basement, Kel and I, and just spend some time alone and like see if that helps like make this turn into the real thing or whatever. And so we just got to be in the basement where it was dark, right? And I'm not taking care of kids. And I don't even remember if we had music on or anything like that. But it did feel like that was kind of a little bit of a trigger, right? Where it made the labor become labor instead of just, I don't know. And so they started to get a little bit closer together. The contractions did, but still nothing impressive. It'd be like 7 or 8 minutes apart. And you guys know, like the 411 and the 511 and types of contractions, all of these conversations can really run through your head of, I know stuff's going on, but this still isn't real, right? This still isn't the when I should go to the hospital time, right? I actually have episodes on both of those topics. If you want more, I would highly suggest listening to them. It's kind of like a part 1 and part 2, episode 37 and 38. And it's all about types of contractions. I know I mentioned that earlier, that prodromal labor, that false labor, and me like wanting it to be the real thing and thinking through that. And then this question of when to go to the hospital. And that's in the part 2, episode 38. So you can totally listen to both of those together, and that will help give you clarity around some of everything that I'm talking about right now. Hey friend, quick pause for just a second. If you are listening to this podcast because you want to feel more prepared, more confident, and less freaked out about birth, that is exactly why I created the Your Body, Your Birth course. This birth course will not tell you what kind of birth you should want, and nobody has the right to do that. It is about helping you understand what's happening in your body, what your options actually are, and how to walk into your birth feeling grounded, excited, ready, instead of overwhelmed and scared. When you have education like this, everything changes. Your mindset, your conversations with your care team, and the birth experience itself. No more relying on random opinions, okay? Stop scrolling. Take intentional action with me and start trusting your body, your voice, and your decisions today. Head over to www.thelabormama.com/birth, also linked in your show notes. And be sure to use the code podcast at checkout to save 20% and start working towards this better birth for you right now. Okay, let's get you back to the episode, because all of this was in my head, right? Of when to go and trying to time it right and getting it right. And so we got to the point where I do not care about the 411 or 511. I really don't care about that for myself at all. You can listen to those episodes and decide how you think about those. But for me, labor and when to go is all about mostly a lot of this other stuff. Because when we decided to head to the hospital, I was not in 411 or 511. I hadn't been this entire time, but I had other stuff going on that just made me think this is real and we probably need to be there as opposed to waiting until my contractions are every 3 or 4 minutes. Like, I think that's going to be too late. So it became a thing of, I'm not waiting for this perfect rhythm. I'm going off all the other signs. And this was just like emotional changes kind of in pressure and the way that my body felt. Certainly the contractions were getting a little stronger, but I still wasn't in any sort of active labor per like a textbook. But I had one contraction, and I talk about this in my first birth story too. There's this one contraction, this one moment where it just makes me say, we should go. And I don't know if it's the way they change or move or this pressure, but there's just this like, it's kind of cool. I'm so attuned to this specific moment and feeling that it's it's not led me astray yet up to this point, right? And so I looked at Cal and was like, we should probably go. And in my first birth, he says, are you sure? He does all the right things. You're doing great at home. Why don't we, do a few more and see how you're doing? He did all the things to support that desire for an unmedicated birth at a hospital. But this time, he was like, great, sprinted up the stairs. Let's leave. He'd already packed the car. Like he was literally just waiting for me to acknowledge that I was in labor. So we did. We got in the car. We were ready to go pretty quickly. This had all been over the span of like an hour, since my cousin had been there and things had turned on. So we could maybe say I'd been in labor for an hour, true labor, half an hour, maybe. I feel like I transitioned in the car. And so I don't really know that I ever felt like I was truly in active labor. I just went from, I'm not really sure, so let's just hold out for a little bit, to like, we should probably go. And I feel like my body switched when my mind and my heart switched too. It kind of all happened at once. So in our drive to the hospital, I mentioned it was about 30 minutes long. I just remember that being a very, very uncomfortable ride. And at this point, all of my rides had been uncomfortable because I was always in the later stages of labor when we decided to go to the hospital. So we had kissed our baby girl, the one not sleeping, pretty quickly, gotten straight in the car. And then it just was like, here it comes. And those 30 minutes are brutal and annoying. And I don't need to go over that. You guys know how it is. I sat in the front seat this time. I don't know what I would recommend. I've sat in the backseat as well. It just is not fun to labor in a car. So there's a hilarious picture of me that Kelvin snapped in profile, like while he was driving. And I just look so sad and so unhappy. But I'm sure that I was just so uncomfortable getting there. When we did get to the unit, like these other times, I delivered where I worked. And so it was so sweet, as always, to just show up and see my friends, right? And to just know they're waiting for me. I texted people when I started to think this was real, trying to see who was on that day and let them know I would probably be coming in and have a baby for them to think about for like patient census. So we had let them know we had a photographer this time. And so we wanted to make sure they made it in time. So there were a little bit of moving pieces in regards to that too, and timing. But ultimately, when we got there, the photographer showed up within a few minutes, and, the friends, the workers, the nurses, everyone was ready. And so it was very calm. It was very steady. Nobody was panicked, including Cal and I, which was great because it feels like, the phrase like coming in hot. There was a little bit of that. It's like, I'm coming in to have a baby, guys. So I hope you have the table ready, because all of a sudden, like, things have changed very, very quickly. I remember apologizing to the charge nurse later because I had called her in the car on the way, and she was trying to ask me some questions and I really wasn't able to answer. And so then later I'm apologizing to her for being like, not letting her know earlier. And she was apologizing to me for trying to like ask me questions when I clearly was in the middle of labor in a car. And so it was this sweet thing where we both were saying, sorry, we could have done better. And really, we both just did a great job. So it wasn't really relevant at all, but we both were feeling bad about the way we tried to communicate to each other. But again, I was in transition in the car. So what are we going to, what can you do? We both just did what we could. When we got to the hospital, we kind of switched into this classic Kelvin low mode of just how we like to have our babies. And so again, kind of this textbooky thing of very, very fast, right? You're picking up on that. I'm sure this is going to move really quick. But we got there, declined cervical checks because I knew I was in labor. They knew I was in labor. Nobody cared about that, right? I remember her calling my midwife, the nurse, and saying, she's here. She doesn't want to have a cervical check. Like, we don't know how far along she is. And it just was not a big deal, right? Because it's not. I'm clearly going to have a baby. Who cares if my cervix is 4, 7, or 9 at that point, right? And the midwife was coming over anyways, since they typically are on the unit and ready and available for someone coming in. My classic move at this point is always hands and knees on the floor too. And so when I first got there, they did do a 20-minute NST, which is standard when you get into the hospital. And that's just where they put the heart monitors on. And so I remember sitting on the birth ball while they did that and watching it. And that was my moment where I felt very nursey. And then I was able to let it go. But every time my kids get monitored, we haven't always had time for it, but in this birth we did. When they get monitored, I do kind of watch, and I'm looking for ACT cells, and I'm making sure there's no D cells. And I do that nurse thing of, are they okay in there? But as soon as that 20 minutes is up and they look good, I want those monitors off. And so they put them on. Baby looked great. And then we were able to take them off. I did have an IV this time. I had not in my second birth. And then I ended up bleeding too much, I guess you could say, after birth. And so I just thought, that's fine. like, I'm fine with IVs either way. So let's just do it this time. So we don't even have to deal with that if that were to happen again. And so then it was really just time to have the baby. I know that sounds kind of anticlimactic, right? But it's that they put in my IV, things were going, we got the monitoring done. And then all of a sudden it was like, guys, I would like to be in hands and knees on the floor. That is like my classic labor position. And it means we're really, really close. And they laid out a mat on the floor and I got down there and I remember a couple of things emotionally. One is the emotional signposts. And I'd really started to see them at home. So that's in episode 10. I do have an episode on this. And I like highly, highly recommend you listen to this episode. And you have any birth partner who's going to be with you, listen to episode 10, because it's a really good way for people to see and pay attention to what is going on with you and how you're progressing in labor without your cervix being checked. It has nothing to do with that. And it has everything to do with your behavior. But your behavior correlates to the stage of labor that you're in. It's very, very cool. It sounds a little woo-woo. It's not. It's actually really, really neat to see. And so at home, I had gone through kind of maybe the beginnings of the doubt or not being sure. There's like this lack of clarity that you can have that's kind of a signpost that you're progressing. And then by the time we were at the hospital, it was very clear that I was in transition because there was this like, I don't know what to do. I just want to have this baby. I'm a little bit overwhelmed. I'm a little bit freaked out. I end up cry. I always cry during labor. Little like lonely tears roll down my cheeks. I always cry during transition, I should say. And so you could see some of these signposts happen. And doubt for me is always a big one of just, am I okay? Are we okay? Can I do this? We have to be close, right? Because if not, I can't handle this anymore. And I do remember my midwife as well saying, hey, after your contraction, why don't you go ahead and take off your underwear? Which cracks me up because I was like minutes away from having the baby and I still had my underwear on, which I feel is just such an indication of me and who I am. Just staying covered up, I like to still be maintain my modesty. I also like to deny that I'm about to have a baby. So why would I need to take my underwear off? Yeah, it's just so me. And so I can still remember her asking me to do that. We were in hands and knees on the floor. Nobody was leaving the room. It was very clear that everyone knew I was going to have a baby and they just let me do my thing. I love this memory of it was all women in the room and remembering, of course, that I'd lost my mom and that, she never could be there for any of my births, obviously, including this one. It was just the sweetness of being really held by some really good women. Oh my gosh, sorry, I'm getting emotional. And so I love that memory. So Kelvin's there with us and then just a bunch of women that I love and worked with and trained with. And I just felt trusted and loved and seen and like all the things that you want for your birth, right? My water popped open when I was my water popped open. That sounded funny. My water broke when I was in hands and knees on the floor. And it'd been maybe, 35 minutes since we'd gotten to the hospital or something like that. And right away it was like, baby's coming. And this was the same as birth 1 and 2. They came immediately after my water broke. And I always prefer to deliver in the bed. So it's I get off the floor by choice and I jump in the bed. Nobody tells me to. And certainly my midwife does not care in this moment. But my water broke, baby was coming. And I'm getting in the bed. And Kelvin knows that too. So he's like, oh, let's go. Let's get you up there. It's just where I feel good. There was no meconium this time, which was great. I'd had meconium in my first 2 births, which was kind of just annoying, right? To think about in those moments. So no meconium. So I remember that being a little win in the midst of having this baby. I tried hands and knees once, pushing in the bed. So I just crawled up into the bed and did hands and knees and I did not like it. I remember so clearly feeling, and this is just me, right? Like so many people deliver in hands and knees. It's a great position to deliver on. So don't hear this as a reason not to do it. I just felt really exposed and uncomfortable and not strong. I'm not going to push well like this. And so I did one push, flipped over to my back. And in that moment, this is cool. This can happen sometimes during labor, but my body kind of gave me a break. And you can see this sometimes during these delivering contractions where they're not 2 minutes apart. I'm saying this particularly if you don't have Pitocin or something going, but in a physiological birth that doesn't have meds on board right now, you can see these kind of cool gaps where it really is a time for you to rest before this next, ideally delivering contraction comes and maybe you're going to have your baby. And so I had flipped over onto my back and then there was this 3-minute gap and it was so chill and people were talking and we were kind of we knew this baby's coming on this next contraction or very likely. And so they had Kelvin come around to catch baby because he wanted to catch them. We did not know the sex of the baby. You probably picked up on that. And so there was also that moment of, we had 2 girls at this point, right? And so everybody in the room is like, are you going to have a boy? Because at this point, there'd been 5 granddaughters born in my family and no one had had a boy. So the thought of a boy was pretty felt pretty impossible, honestly. So we were waiting for that sweet surprise. And next contraction was just, I don't want to say easy, but it was clear that this was the time to have this baby. So it felt right, if that makes sense. So an easy, I said easy again, didn't I? But just push through the ring of fire, like push into Kelvin's hands. Babe rotated. They were OA, but they had rotated and looked up at the sky, like after the first push to deliver the head. And so that is not normal. So they were like looking up at everybody. So saw Kelvin, saw dad, right? Because he's waiting right there. And then, the midwife and her student were standing back next to him as well. But it was pretty cool to see in pictures and video because typically they rotate the other way. And for whatever reason, baby came out, their head came out and they rotated up to look up. I forgot to push. I didn't want to push for the rest. And so I remember them saying, hey, my sweet nurse, Ashley, she's like, you got to push one more time for the rest. So one more push and baby was out. Baby was a boy and that room erupted in the girliest cheers, which going back to what I said of all these women and not having my mom. Sorry, guys. Sorry. It was just so sweet to hear this like very feminine support and celebration over this tiny little boy. Okay. So anyways, I had a boy. Calvin handed him off to me. He got to call it out, right? Because he held him up and looked and handed him over to me. And that was that. I mean, third baby, fast birth. It was about 42 or 44 minutes. I can't remember the exact from like getting admitted at the front desk to having him. So I know I just blabbered on for like 25 minutes about all of that, but it was quick, right? We did not have a lot of time to do anything except get you checked in, get you ready, water broke, have the baby. But it was peaceful. It was not panicked. It was incredible. I mean, it was very quick, but not so quick that it would cause any sort of like trauma or angst. It just felt calm. I felt trusted. It was amazing. The whole time was really, really great. As for postpartum, I know that's like a quick jump into that, but it makes me think back to our COVID conversation, just this idea of the way COVID kind of impacted it. So when we got into the hospital, I know I'm jumping back into labor and we don't need to spend time there more, but there was you have to wear a mask and everybody has to get screened and everybody has to get checked. And I share that because the postpartum was also very much the season where no one's allowed in the room except like your nurse and your providers, and then could have the one birth partner and the photographer, which was obviously a huge blessing that they were allowed to come as well. And so my girls did not get to come in and meet their brother, which sucked. I think that is probably the part that I liked the least about this birth experience is I would have loved for them to have come and to have met him. I did not mind the quiet and the lack of other people coming in and out. Not at all. We like that time. We like that space. And we typically love going home after about 24 hours if we can. And so that was what we were able to do. We did go home the next day and the girls actually stayed with our cousins for one more night per our choice. And we just got to have this one sweet night at home post-birth, not being in the hospital, and before our girlies came home to just spend with him and reflect and fall in love or whatever cheesy thing that you want to say. Not sleep, obviously. Learn to breastfeed, obviously. And that was really sweet. I'm so grateful we got to do that. And then the next day, our girls came home and we just kind of waltzed into life with three in a world that was still very much closed down, right? So definitely our little bubble in our little pocket. When it comes to postpartum, one of the things that has been such a gift about my son's story in that postpartum is going back to that theme of redemption. And it felt like he really redeemed my postpartum experience. My pregnancies and my births, like I shared, were pretty great, pretty beautiful with both the girls, even in the midst of what was going on. I mean, I had personal challenges, but clinically, like all of that stuff went really good. My postpartums were just tragically hard. I don't know how else to say it. I just could not keep myself together. I had postpartum anxiety after my second. My mom died after my first. I was in so many bad spaces mentally and emotionally that I just didn't realize that postpartum could also be really sweet and that it didn't have to feel like such a struggle to enjoy this baby and be grateful for them and also just be wrecked in all these other ways. And so my son really redeemed postpartum for me. And that felt like such a gift to know, oh, postpartum can be joyful more than broken. And you can be like really, really excited about a new life more than devastated by other things going on. And I know that sounds a little dramatic, but I just don't know that I'd had a postpartum experience up to that point that felt normal, like just normal challenges and not really big ones that, had really broken me or hurt me or challenged Kel and I and our kids. So that was such a gift to have a postpartum that looked like that and felt like that. Breastfeeding went really well. Overall, I had Deemer again. You can hear me share a little bit more about that in my second birth story, but it's a breastfeeding condition that is kind of sucky. I knew it would happen again. I assumed it would. And so I was more ready for it. So that sucked, but I was more expected. I did do placenta encapsulation this time. I'm not going to deep dive that here, but I do like to mention that. And then my big thing with it is we're going to do an episode on this with someone who's a professional in the space and can speak to it really eloquently and really well. And so that'll be up soon. But I like to share that I did it and also say, because a lot of people, there's not great evidence for it. Like all of that is true. Okay. So I want you to hear that. But the possible mental health benefits, which again are like possible and anecdotal, to me were so potentially important and valuable after how horrible some of that had been for me with my other girls, that I just was almost desperate to do or try anything that might help me have a better postpartum, particularly in my head and my heart. So we'll talk more about that later, but I just wanted to throw that in there because it was a different part of my postpartum experience. And this was my best postpartum experience. I healed really quickly. I felt great pretty quickly. He was a lovely baby. Breastfeeding went great aside from having Deemer. Like it just felt like it redeemed a lot of things for me. And I know I keep coming back to that, but it's a phrase that gets tossed around a lot in births about wanting a redemptive story. And I think sometimes it can apply to birth. Sometimes it can apply to postpartum. Sometimes it can apply to both. And for me, he really kind of brought some of the goodness full circle. So such a gift to have him. All right, you guys. Again, if you want to listen to the first one, that's episode 1. If you want to listen to the second one, that's episode 12. I know I mentioned some other more educational stuff for you that I kind of went through in my births, and we will drop all of the links for those episodes in the show notes. You can go back and listen to whatever I may have mentioned that piqued your interest.
Thank you so much for listening to the Lo and Behold podcast. I hope there was something for you in today's episode that made you think, made you laugh, or made you feel seen. For show notes and links to the resources, freebies, or discount codes mentioned in this episode, please head over to loandbeholdpodcast.com. If you aren't following along yet, make sure to tap subscribe or follow in your podcast app so we can keep hanging out together. And if you haven't heard it yet today, you're doing a really good job. A little reminder for you before you go. Opinions shared by guests of this show are their own and do not always reflect those of myself and the Labor Mama platform. Additionally, the information you hear on this podcast or that you receive via any linked resources should not be considered medical advice. Please see our full disclaimer at the link in your show notes.